Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. If you can hear us very well. Just type "I can hear you." Just type where you're coming from, you are joining us from, and we would acknowledge you. Great, thanks for joining us, Janat Ahmed, Zainab Mohammed, Mika Mohammed. Thank you so much for joining us. Great. We'll be starting in a moment, and just for you to know, this is the first of our webinar series on the topic you asked us to work on. You asked that we work on, we do presentations on job application strategies and tips. So we decided to start with how to succeed in your UN job application. And today we have a great person with us, an expert in the field who will give us a lot of information, and it promises to be a very great session. Thanks for all of you joining via YouTube. YouTube page is relatively new, and we have a bigger following on LinkedIn, and I see LinkedIn is just picking up with a lot of people. Thank you so much for joining us, and I think we can go ahead now. So my name is Isaac Osei-Owusu, and I'm joining in from Ghana, the coordinator for Opportunities for Youth. And I'm here with Katia. I'll leave her to introduce herself and take it from there. Katia.
Excellent. All right. Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's so nice to see so many people joining. My name is Katia Hemmerich. I am a former chief of career support and performance management in the United Nations Secretariat. And I've written a blog post for Opportunities for Youth. I've had a good collaboration with them, giving you guys some insider tips on applying to the UN, which I wanted to go through with everyone today. So just a little bit more background on myself. I'm currently based in New York. I am working at the moment as an HR advisor, a human resources advisor, also to the UN Office on Project Services. And basically, I've had a career, certainly in the last 10, 15 years, focused on reform of international organizations, or reform very specifically of the UN, trying to make it better for the people that we serve, and make it work more effectively. And now I have actually started a think tank also working on those issues. So it's great that there are this many people actually interested in joining the UN. We really do need lots of great new talent with new perspectives and new ideas, and that's certainly what the UN is looking for. So hopefully this session will be helpful also in getting you to improve your applications and make yourselves more competitive in what is already a very competitive process. So very briefly, just what I wanted to do today is I'll talk maybe for about 10 minutes or so, give you some of my tips. And what I want to do in giving my tips is also give you more about the background and the context of why the process is the way it is, because that helps you figure out how to navigate it a little bit better. And then Isaac and I wanted to open up and take questions from everyone in the chat. So if you have a question, please feel free, just type it into the chat, and hopefully we can also get to it towards the end of the session. So with that, let me jump in. And, you guys probably all know this, but I just want to highlight that the UN is an intergovernmental organization. And what that means is that really it's made up of 193 different countries, and really 193 governments. And they are ultimately the boss of the organization. So I know people are used to thinking of the Secretary General as the boss, but really he has another boss, and those are 193 governments. And the reason I flag this is because it makes the UN and any intergovernmental organization a bit of a unique context. And that also flows down to the recruitment process, as I'll tell you. But first, let me start on the big picture. Working for 193 different countries can be phenomenally rewarding. Where else in the world other than the UN can you actually have contact with people from 193 countries if you're at the headquarters all in the same day, potentially, right? Again, if you work outside of the headquarters, there are potentially 193 countries. The UN doesn't necessarily have an office in every one of them, but certainly in well over 100 countries, you could go live and work and meet people from all over the world. So it comes with phenomenal opportunities that you maybe don't have anywhere else with any other kind of job, right? But what it also means, the flip side is that when you want to get things done, particularly when you want to change things about how the UN works, that requires negotiation and agreement with 193 countries. And that can be phenomenally difficult and frustrating. And so I want you guys just to keep this a little bit in mind, because what it also means is when the UN hires people, they need to convince 193 countries that that hiring process was fair and that it wasn't subjective and that they didn't discriminate. And that's sometimes what makes that process a little bit slow and cumbersome. So I'll walk you through that. But one of the main things I want you guys to take away from this is that communication skills are phenomenally important. Written communication skills, oral communication skills, because just remember, your context for everything is that ultimately you're working with 193 countries and trying to get them to agree with what you're trying to do, right? And in the case of your application, you're trying to convince 193 countries that you're the right candidate for the job, right? So here are the tricks. I'm going to walk you through the tricks of what that means and how you guys need to read the vacancy announcements and how you need to tailor your communications. Because ultimately, while you'll use your communication and negotiation skills throughout your UN career, the first place where it gets tested, both intentionally and unintentionally, is really through the recruitment process. So if you can get through that, and if you can demonstrate what you're going to need throughout your UN career, which is a lot of determination and interest in, really making the world a better place, but you also need to have a thick skin and you need to have a lot of perseverance to get through this process, because it's a very competitive process, right? The UN Secretariat alone gets over 600,000 applications each year. So just keep in mind, every time you're applying for the UN for a UN job, you're competing against the whole rest of the world, and there's a lot of people out there. So, but here's how you can really make yourself competitive in this process. First, one of the main things that you need to keep in mind throughout the process is, because what you need to do is not necessarily prove that you're the best candidate. What you need to prove is you're the candidate who meets the requirements to a T, basically, right? And there's a slight difference in that. I mean, if you meet the requirements, you should be the best candidate. But I think it's a different way of thinking about your communications. And the issue here is, again, in that context of trying to convince all of the people who will review your application, who are trying to make sure that it's fair and that the right candidate has been chosen, and to convince 193 member states that the process is fair, they're not going to look and subjectively decide who's the best. To take the subjectivity out of that, what they're doing is trying to show that you're the candidate who has met the requirements as specifically as possible. And so your first starting point is always to read the vacancy announcement. And logically, what you guys are going to read first are the responsibilities of a job, right? And that's important for you to decide whether it's a job you're actually interested in. But what I'm going to say is, that part is actually not the most important part of the vacancy announcement. When you then decide, once you've decided that's a job I want to apply for, what you want to do is actually take a very close look at the requirements. And most important are really the education requirements and the work experience requirements, because this is the first step where you need to prove that you meet these requirements. Again, doesn't necessarily need to be the best, but what they're doing is sifting through these hundreds and potentially thousands of applications as a first step to see who are the people who meet the requirements. And so there's going to be different people involved in this. There may at some point be computers that are sifting through it. So you need to make it crystal clear and very obvious to any reader, no matter what their background is, how your education meets the requirements and how your work experience meets the requirements, right? So Justin, as an example, I worked a lot in areas related to learning and training. And so we would often ask, it would say, we would like someone with 5 years of work experience in learning and development with demonstrated experience using a learning management system. So most people who work in learning, you guys are all in education, you guys work with learning management systems all the time, right? So you might think it's obvious. Of course, if I designed a course and, I posted on the platform, of course I know how an LMS works, right? A learning management system. Not everybody reading that application knows that level of detail about how learning works and what a learning management system is. So you really need to look at that phrase in the vacancy announcement. If that's what they're looking for, make sure in your application form, it's clear each time when you worked on learning and development, how many years was it? And what did you do? Make sure it says clearly in the words, I used a learning management system, or I designed it, or I set it up, or whatever it may be, right? So assume always that you have a variety of different readers and that they have different backgrounds. So you're trying to make it obvious and clear to everyone how what they're asking for in the vacancy announcement is actually reflected in your application. And one important thing for you guys to consider as well and be aware of, when I say application, what I'm talking about is the form on the platform that they're asking you to fill out. Often I think they call these personal history profiles, but they might have different names for different UN agencies. But it's the most important to make sure that how you fit the requirements is reflected in that form, not necessarily in your cover letter. A cover letter is always a little bit of a bonus for the hiring manager, but it's not what they use to make decisions about how you meet the requirements. So think of the cover letter in a way, it's a good way to draw the attention and in a very succinct and concise way to say, hey, look at my application because I can show you I worked in learning in these 3 organizations, and in 2 of those organizations, I had experience with a learning management system, right? You can draw attention to things in your application, but the more important part where decisions are made about whether you continue through the recruitment process, it's all about that application form. So make sure it's crystal clear in there how you meet those requirements. So that's the first step. If you get through the first step, obviously it is a huge positive because, as I said, there's a significant number of applicants for every single position. So, you've got a lot of competition, but it's by no means the end of the road because quite a few people will come through that first screening of the application. And that's often why the second step in the process is a written test of some form. And really the reality is I've had cases where you have over 500 applications for a position. When you look at who meets the minimum requirements, you probably still have 100 people in there. You can't do 100 interviews, right? So that's what they're trying to do with the written test is then go further into your communication skills and your technical skills. How can you convey in writing that what you can do what the job is looking to do? So the written tests will tend to focus now more on topics that are covered in the responsibilities of your vacancy announcement. So now is maybe the time to go back to that vacancy announcement and read through those responsibilities and get a sense of what's in the job. And you'll get a sense of what they're probably going to test. But again, really key is this idea of there's going to be an objective review to make sure that the rules were followed and that, everyone was treated fairly. So the most important thing in the written test is actually read the instructions and follow the instructions. If there's 100 other people who are doing the test they can't give you an exception if you were just a minute late, right? Because then if you were a minute late handing in the test, what about the next person who was 2 minutes late? Shouldn't they give them an exception, right? So it can seem unfair sometimes that you're like, I was so close to the time and then I got thrown out of the process, but it's because they're trying to show that they basically treated everybody the same and nobody got any favors, right? They're trying to show that this whole process is fair. So let me just reiterate again, with the written test, they're not trying to trick you. They should send you instructions well in advance, at least a week in advance. Read those instructions. If they send you a practice test or some practice questions, they're trying to show you how the test is going to work. Do those practice questions, check those out, so really that's the key on the written test. Just read the instructions, follow the instructions to the letter. If you make it through that phase, then you get invited to an interview. And this, again, you've gone from potentially several hundred applicants down to usually somewhere between 5 and 10, maybe 15 people maximum will be interviewed. It depends on the situation. So if you make it to the interview, you've actually done very, very well already. But again, the process is not over, right? So, and here in the interview, now you're switching from your written communication skills to your oral communication skills, right? And most UN entities, most UN agencies, they tend to use what's called competency-based interviewing. And what they're trying to do with the competency-based interviewing is get you to explain through examples how you've demonstrated a certain competency in the past already. Because the idea is that if you've demonstrated this competency in the past, then you can also do it in the future when you're working for the UN, right? And here's where, one, you want to go back to the vacancy announcement and look at what competencies they are looking for. Be familiar with those and prepare yourself beforehand. Once you know what competencies they're looking for, think about your past experience. And it doesn't just need to be work experience, right? You guys have interesting experience from university, right? Where you've potentially worked on group projects and you can demonstrate teamwork. I'm sure a lot of you guys are volunteers or working on whether it's a side gig or different kinds of projects. Really think throughout your experience, how can you demonstrate the competencies that they're looking for? And here's where, again, you need to use your communication skills. What you want to do is, one, explain the context of the background of your example when you come to the interview. And then in your example, highlight very clear what your role was and what you did to demonstrate the competency. And I highlight this, it sounds a little bit egotistical, and it is a little bit egotistical. It's often described as somewhat of a Western approach to interviewing, which has its shortcomings in certain ways. And I think for a lot of people, it seems a bit counterintuitive, because in most UN vacancy announcements, they're looking for team players, right? And teamwork is one of the common competencies that you'll see. But now I just told you in the interview, you guys are supposed to be egotistical and just talk about yourself, right? So it's a struggle, especially for real team players. They kind of go, but how do I do that? And I've often seen people struggle with that in the interview. And you're right, it is a bit contradictory. But one of the things I think, again, in the interest of demonstrating to everybody after the end of the interview why you met the requirements and why you demonstrated this competency, that's why they're trying to understand a little bit the egotistical part about what you did, right? And this is where I think a good tactic that I've seen a lot of people use very effectively is, your natural instinct, which is to say, here's the example, we worked as a team and we achieved this as a team, right? That's a good instinct. Keep running with that. But what you want to do is, once you say, as a team, we achieved this, then go drill down and say, my role in the team was X. And this is how I demonstrated this competency in that role. And this is why it worked within the team, because people appreciated that I did A, B, and C, right? Or people appreciated that I saw it from their perspective. So that's kind of a very good way that I've seen to combine both showing that you're a team player, but also showing to the interview panel, hey, I, as the individual person, actually have this competency. And you can tell people after the interview that I met the required competency because I showed it wasn't my team that did this, but I demonstrated this competency, right? So that's kind of a little bit the way to navigate the system. So it's a very long and unwieldy system, and like I say, it certainly tests your communication skills. And really, please keep that in mind. You have multiple different people reading your application, reading the reports of the interviews, and everybody's trying to see that it's fair. So in all your communications, what you're trying to do is show how you meet the requirements, right? Keep that in mind and keep tailoring your communications around that. And keep that in mind when you're reading the vacancy announcement, right? So what exactly are the requirements that they're looking for? Anytime you see the word required, highlight that, and you need to make sure that is always listed in your written application, wherever you can bring that out, right? And ultimately, beyond communication skills, as I said, you need a lot of determination and perseverance. You are competing against the whole world, which is not easy. There's a lot of good qualified people out there. So don't give up after the first try. It is normal. It takes a lot of different tries, a lot of different attempts. And all I can say is if you're determined and if you persevere, and if you can show that you meet the requirements, somewhere it'll eventually come together. Just be patient and hang in there. And I think maybe let me stop on that note because I'm starting to see already a lot of questions and comments. So maybe we'll jump into a few of those before we then tie everything together at the end. How does that sound, Isaac?
That sounds great. Thank you so much. I think you've been very, very clear and you've been spot on in your presentation. And I would like us to just go a little bit back. Some questions started coming in just when you started. Um, I think some seem to get the impression that from what you are saying, the cover letter is not that important. Can you just
Oh, I think I lost you, Isaac. Can you guys still hear me?
can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, I can hear you again. All good. Can you
Yes,
hear me? All right,
yes,
perfect.
yes. So I wanted us to start from the point of the cover letter. Uh, some seem to get the impression that from your presentation, the cover letter is not really important. I'm not sure you said that, but could you just go over that point for us?
Yes, no, that's I'm glad you guys caught that. It's not irrelevant. I don't want to say it's not important at all, but it is by far less important than your actual application form. So if I were doing an application, my advice would be spend 85 to 90% of your time on perfecting your application form and really making sure that that has all the requirements listed and that it's very clear. And then maybe spend 10 to 15% of your time on the cover letter. The cover letter will potentially catch people's attention, but there are some of the recruiting platforms. The way it works, you can see the cover letter, but some of them just go straight into the application form and will pull out your work experience, your education. So some hiring managers might just zone straight into, do these people have the right work experience? They might not actually read the cover letter. Other hiring managers might start with the cover letter, again, because it's a good way to check communication skills. So particularly when written communication is important, they'll go through a cover letter and sort of say, listen, this person, clearly is a good communicator. I want to take a closer look at this application form, right? So the cover letter is not irrelevant, but it's by far the least important. So it's
Okay.
much more important to devote your energy to the application form.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like to go to the next question. I think the questions are really going to come in a lot, so maybe you can keep your answers a bit short for us. The next question is on experience. You touched on that they would like to know who is more experienced or who meets the experience requirements. The UN often asks for experience, but I mean, much of our audience today are students who will be moving into the job sector very soon and all of that. So it's not, they don't have so much of work experience with international organizations or even with the UN. So how do they go about it as a student? How do you transition into the UN without any real work experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's tough if you have no work experience at all, simply because it is quite a competitive process. But if you look at the more junior level posts, and so often these will be like the at the professional level, which is sort of internationally recruited, which means you work outside of your home country in most cases. Um, for P1 and P2 positions, which are really the entry level positions, it shouldn't require, I think the P2 maybe 1 or 2 years. The P1 shouldn't require any experience. Again, in the context of you're competing against the whole world, chances are you are going to have people who have some work experience. But here's where I think, again, you can highlight some of your experience at university. I think a lot of universities are doing really interesting work study projects, group projects. You can highlight there where you've demonstrated experience. Volunteer opportunities, I would absolutely, even if you're volunteering or it's a side gig, even if it's part-time, but feel free, I think, put that in there. It all shows that you are able to work in different contexts, and it's certainly valuable experience. If you can get an internship at the UN, that's great. Again, those are also competitive and not always paid, so that's difficult. But even internships, whether it's the private sector or at a non-governmental organization, all of those are useful things to put on and to highlight that you have some work experience. Oh, I lost you again, Isaac. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. So I think when you mention the work experience in terms of getting volunteering experience and internship experience, I think it's important. And I think volunteering experiences are easier to get. So students could look into that and it helps a lot. Let's take these two questions and you can answer them together. Sophie is asking on LinkedIn, what if we meet 80% of the requirements? Is it still worth a shot? And the next question, I think, is also simple. Why does it take a very long time to hear from UN agencies after application submission?
Okay. Let me maybe take the second question first, because it's a very good question, but it's an easy one to answer. So it really goes back to the point I was making before around you have so many different levels to try and make sure that the process is fair, and that no one's been discriminated against and that the process has been followed, right? And again, ultimately, it's 193 countries that are checking to make sure that that process is fair and that their people haven't been discriminated against. So it's all of these extra layers and these extra checks combined with the huge number of applications that makes it so slow, unfortunately. There are a lot of human resources officers trying to find ways to make it faster, but I think you guys just need to kind of accept that, unfortunately, the process is always going to be somewhat slow because you're competing against so many people. So that was the second question. Refresh my memory. What was the first question again?
The first question is, what if you meet just 80% of the requirements?
Okay, so yes, that one is a good question. So one, I think, let me also flag, women have a tendency to sort of look at vacancy announcements and go, oh, I don't quite meet it. I probably shouldn't apply, versus men often have a tendency to go, I'm pretty close. I can show how I did this for sure. Yeah. Right. And I'm just going to say we should all take much more of a male attitude, right? Think really positively about your own qualities. So, in most cases, I would say go for it. That said, I am going to caveat again back to, the point around you need to show that you're meeting the requirements. Where it becomes tricky is you need to sort of look at what are the minimum requirements, right? And this is where, when you're reading the vacancy announcement, differentiate between what they're saying is required. Again, where you see that word required, that's a must-have. So if it says you need to have a master's degree and you're not finished your master's degree, that's one where it's not worth taking a shot, right? That's a very clear black and white. They've said it's required. But where you have the phrases, something is desirable, or experience working in an NGO is an asset, or the ability to speak 3 other languages is useful, right? When you see phrases like that, that's more in the nice to have. I mean, it's not a minimum requirement like the education one is. So if you meet 80% of those, nice to haves, something that's desirable or an asset or something is preferred, if you meet 80% of those, absolutely go for it, right? Because again, you need to meet the minimum requirements where it says required, something is required or something is a requirement. That one's a black and white, right? If you don't meet that one, then probably not worth a shot. But all of the other ones, absolutely go for it, even if it's just 60 or 70%, but you should totally go for it.
Wow, thank you very much. Let me just read this comment from Mark Lewis. He says he's a former UN program manager. He says, I agree. Cover letter, we barely see it, perhaps just before the interview. So maybe that just goes to buttress what you said. Let's take this question from Rachel. She says that once someone is included in a consultant roster, what steps or strategies would you recommend to improve their chances of being selected for an assignment?
Okay, interesting question. So just to clarify, a consultant roster is different than a staff position roster, and those two are not interchangeable. Okay. So think that through when you join a roster. So consultant rosters, I think they work somewhat differently in different organizations. But in all cases, sort of a roster implies that your application has already been vetted and that essentially you meet the minimum requirements for something, right? And then these lists get shared with whoever is trying to hire either the consultant or the staff person. And this is why, again, those lists don't cross over. If somebody is looking to hire a staff person off a roster, they only get the staff person roster. They do not look at the consultant roster. And vice versa, if someone is looking for a consultant, they only get the consultant roster. They don't get the list of staff, the staff roster. So that's why keep in mind and just know which roster you want to apply for and which roster you're on. Okay. From that point on, there's not much I think you can do individually. It's how you framed your application, and that's shared with the different people hiring. It is often useful, I find, particularly LinkedIn, there's a lot of information floating around about when people are looking for particular consultants or where they need help. And it can be useful to flag if you see something like that on LinkedIn and just say, hey, I'm on a roster for this consultant in your organization already. Maybe that's useful, right? And depending on how the consultancy has been set up and how the organization works, they might be able to go back and say, wait, there's a different roster for consultants than the one I looked at, and I wasn't aware this person is on there. That could potentially help. But to a large extent, once you're on the roster, it's kind of in the hands of the organization, and it's a little bit hard for you to sort of adjust your application at that point.
Well, thank you very much. We've had a lot of questions in terms of language, so I would want to put all of them together and ask it this way. Which languages are important for your work as somebody applying for a position in the UN? Which languages are important? And I believe English is very important, but apart from English, what other languages? If you could give us maybe the top 3 or 4 languages that are necessary. Thank you.
Got it. So the 2 working languages of the UN are English and French, right? And again, I grew up in Canada. It's very much a model like in Canada. English and French, in principle, are treated equally, and you should be able to work in, ideally, both English and French. But if you can work in English or French, then that should be sufficient. The reality is that there is a bit of a bias towards English. There are more English speakers, and certainly in New York, most people will work only in English. Geneva, of course, is slightly different as a headquarters. There you get kind of a mix of English and French. But they are both the working languages. So it's important that you can demonstrate that you are proficient enough to work in at least one of those two languages, right? And again, the vacancy announcement will usually specify which one they want fluency in. That said, so the UN has 6 official languages, Arabic, Chinese, Russian, Spanish, in addition to English and French. So those languages are important, but certainly from a recruitment perspective, the 2 languages where the UN really needs a lot of help and often struggles to find people is French speakers and Arabic speakers. So if you are fluent in English and French and Arabic, that is fantastic. Make sure you highlight that everywhere, and certainly look for those vacancy announcements where they're saying that they want fluency in some combination of those languages, because that's where you're going to have a lot less competition, quite frankly, than something that just wants English. And again, that's where really the UN is struggling often to find well-qualified people who speak French and Arabic in particular are the 2 that come up most often. If you want to work in Latin America, Spanish becomes phenomenally important, obviously. So that's sort of something to keep in mind.
Okay, so just keep in mind French, Arabic, and maybe Spanish. Those will have more opportunities or less competitive opportunities.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, all right, that's fine. Now we having questions around CV, framing your CV, how you structure your CV or your resume for UN positions. Is there any tip you want us to know?
Basically, yes. I mean, the easiest tip is just to say each UN agency, unfortunately, has their own version of a CV or a resume that they want, right? And they set that up on their platforms. And these are often quite detailed. They are really much more like a very traditional CV. They want a lot of detail in there in most cases. So the main tip is go to the platform and follow their form, right? There's a reason that they have the form set up like that they're looking for certain things in the process. So follow their form. There now, for instance, I think the UNDP, the UN Development Program, has a platform where you can also upload a CV, and then their platform will translate that CV into their own form, essentially, and that may be the way of the future. So maybe if you're applying to UNDP, you can invest in creating a resume or a CV. But honestly, in most cases, I would say go to the platform of the UN agency where you're applying first and follow their form. Don't stress out about creating a separate CV.
Okay, a quick follow-up to that. What about AI, the use of AI in applications? What do you advise?
Yes. So far as I'm aware, the use of AI in recruitment is still fairly limited. Again, I think there's UNDP is a little bit the leader on this, and others will likely follow. But again, in the interest of the process being fair and making sure that it's followed correctly, the UN has been very careful about using AI for any kind of decision making in the recruitment process, which goes back to the question around why is it so slow? If they delegated everything to AI, it might be a lot faster, but the risks around somehow the process not being followed, or because you've got applications from all over the world that something was misunderstood because, one country's education system is different than another, those risks are all too big for the UN. They want to make sure that the process is followed. So AI may be used to, again, in the first sort of section, to go through the application forms and make sure that you have the right years of experience, that you meet some of those minimum requirements, that you have a university degree. It will check the basics, but all of the more nuanced parts are always going to be checked by a human. And the decisions are going to be made by humans. So just keep that one in mind. Hopefully that makes it fairer, but it does make it a bit slower.
Yeah. So let's take it from the perspective of the applicant. The applicant using AI. What do you say about that?
Okay. That is a good question. I haven't necessarily experienced that. You guys might need to test that out. it's certainly worth, I mean, I don't see, back to the cover letter. The cover letter is probably a good one where you can use AI to create a quick cover letter, and minimize the work for you and have it well written. Um, I would be a bit cautious. Like I say, the AI, because you're filling in the form the way it's set up on each UN agency's platform, I'm not sure AI is sophisticated enough to really, again, pick up the nuance of what I mentioned in the vacancy announcement about what is required and making sure that that's reflected in your application form. So without having tested it myself, if I were the applicant and I were using AI, I would use it for the cover letter, but I would want to invest my own time and my own interpretation of how to frame my experience in the application form itself.
Okay, thank you very much. I would want to take these two questions. They seem to be a bit related. Um, Charlotte Zegler is asking that she reached a level of the interview level and didn't go through, but she wants to just know what are some of the criteria at that stage. I think you touched on that, but maybe you should want to know a little bit more. And quite linked to that is this question whether we can have, because I also saw you touched on that, whether you could just give us an idea of the different levels and what they mean in regards to work experience in terms of that. There are different levels of work in the UN, and what work experience in terms of what they mean. I don't know. However, you want to go about that question,
Got it.
just give idea.
Yes.
Thank you, Clyde.
Yeah, no, those are two good questions to combine. So I'm going to start with the second one first, but I'll lead to the answer on the first one. So the different levels. So let me start maybe the highest level. One thing to consider, which is quite important, is there is a difference in the UN between what we call internationally recruited positions and locally recruited positions. And it is not always so easy to switch from one to the other. So that's the first thing you need to think about. So internationally recruited, it comes with, again, they will travel you to wherever the position is. You get more benefits in terms of if you have kids, education grant, home leave, so money to travel back home, because the idea is that it's an international position and you're going to move around to different countries. Locally recruited means you work in your own home country. And so a lot of these benefits around moving don't exist. And the reason I flag this is, one, for the UN Secretariat in particular, so things like the Department of Peacekeeping, or Peace Operations, as it's now called, the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, the UN Environment Program, all of those, if you start as locally recruited, it's very, very difficult to transition to an internationally recruited position. Basically, in most cases, what they will ask you to do is to resign and then apply again separately. So it's not the greatest career path, even though actually locally recruited positions are often very, very interesting and you can get some great experience. And certainly when I've worked as an international staff, the local staff have been crucial to success. So I don't want to say locally recruited positions are no good, and they're actually phenomenally important. But if you're looking for an international career, you should apply straight for the internationally recruited positions. And those, the starting level is P1. You see those very, very rarely, although I am going to say Kofi Annan, who most of you will be familiar with, he started as a P1 and worked his way all the way up to Secretary General. So, you could start at the bottom and move all the way up, although it's rare. But the P1s, I think generally there's no work experience required. Again, it could be competitive, so you should still list what you can with volunteer opportunities. Then it moves up P2, P3, P4, and P5, and then you jump into the director level. So the ones that are interesting for you guys as entry level points are P1, P2, which I think requires about 2, maybe 3 years of work experience, and P3, which requires 5 years of work experience and a master's degree. But those are the three that I would kind of target, in your cases as sort of trying to get your foot in the door, and depending on how much work experience you have. Now, how this then comes to the question with the interview. So as I mentioned, the interviews usually are competency based. So they're going to ask you questions about, can you demonstrate or can you give us an example of how you worked in a team and how you made sure that team functioned effectively, right? That would be to test your teamwork abilities. And here's where the levels sometimes come in that you need to think about as much as you can. I mean, so obviously, if you're applying to a higher level post like a P3 position where they expect 5 years of work experience and, increasing responsibility, you want to use examples that illustrate, some of this, that you have more sophisticated experience and that you have more sort of complex examples, right? So the more work experience you need, the more you need to show that you have sophisticated examples. If you're interviewing for a P1, they're not going to expect you to have an example of where I worked in a team, in a company or in a big NGO, and they're certainly not going to expect that you led a team. Now, the more, again, you can find examples, whether it's from university where you led a project, great. That shows, again, leadership and teamwork. But obviously, your types of examples naturally will get more sophisticated as you gain more work experience. And just think that through in the interview, because that may be one of the things you may have demonstrated that you have the competency, but in the end, the person who was chosen might have had more sophisticated examples just based on their experience. So that might have been the situation with that interview question.
Oh, great. Thank you. So let's take these questions from Helena asking on LinkedIn. First, she's asking, would it be helpful or would it be useful to apply for a position that matches my qualifications, but where I might be underqualified in terms of years of experience? So this person may have the the educational experience, but years of experience may not be matching up. And the second question she asks is regarding internships, is it worth applying if I'm finished with my PhD program but exceed the age limit?
So very quickly on internships, there is no age limit as far as I'm aware. But what they do want for the internships is that you are enrolled in usually a master's or a PhD, or you've just finished it. So the internship should be within 1 year of you having completed your degree. So I would say it's for sure worth going for the internship. One thing you might also want to explore if you have a PhD, there are some UN entities that also have fellowship programs, which also try and bring in, again, PhDs or more people focused on research to work on specific projects, which again can be a very interesting way to gain experience, to gain some UN experience on your CV. So I would certainly look at those two. In terms of the other question with the work experience, so the here again is where you need to really take a close look at what is the exact wording in the vacancy announcement. Generally, they will start with some kind of phrase under work experience. As I said, for instance, a P3, 5 years of experience in X is required. Usually that X is quite vague, right? So it might be 5 years in human resources, 5 years in peace building, or 5 years in project management, right? They'll keep that fairly high level. That 5 years is kind of non-negotiable, though. That comes under one of the requireds, and that's a black and white. So you can interpret, if you look at your experience, and you have 5 years, maybe not all of it was 100% in project management, but you can illustrate that in your 5 years, you did project management in all of those jobs in those 5 years, then go for it. But if you actually only have 3 years of work experience, then no, you don't want to do that, right? And it's just not worth it, because that's one of those black and whites where they will say this person doesn't meet the requirement. They can't justify putting you through the process. That said, sometimes there's, beyond that first sentence, there's more sophisticated sort of other requests, right? It might say something like 2 years working in a conflict context is desirable, right? So if you have maybe a year and a half, again, it's desirable or it's an asset. then I would say absolutely go for it, right? So that's I think how you need to look at that. And again, how you read that section on experience is so important. So really go through it carefully.
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of questions around that, but I think you've been able to touch on it. You read the requirement, the wording of the advert in terms of the fact that are they required or it's just desirable, and that helps. That will guide you. So I think those asking questions in relation to that should deal with it. So I would like to ask this question from our theory, uh, our Ture. Yeah. When filling out work experience for the application, should we copy what is in our CV or do we go into more detail?
Okay, that is a good question. So again, I think you need to look at each platform and what they're looking for. So sometimes, usually what the UN wants is tends to be more detailed, certainly than in a typical resume, right? The platform may divide it up and they may say describe your responsibilities and then describe your achievements in two separate boxes. So definitely you want to, you may want to just copy the responsibilities from your CV, but you want to highlight in the achievements. I mean, depends on how you've written your CV. A good CV probably should highlight achievements as well. But take a look at, how many characters do they have in there? I'm not saying you always have to fill the box because sometimes that's very long and it can be hard for hiring managers to go through all those very, very long CVs and they might miss the detail. But you can get an indicator if it's a very large box, then probably add more detail, right? If it's a very short box, then keep it very tight. But always keep in mind the more important part is really what was written under the required work experience and do you have that reflected in the box, right? That's the more important part. And just briefly, because I saw one question come through and sort of say, what happens if I exaggerate or lie regarding my work experience? Do not do that. Please do not do that. Unfortunately, there have been cases where people have lied about education or some of their experience, and some of those cases have been quite serious, particularly at senior levels. I'm going to say they have caused in some cases very serious credibility and political problems for the UN. So they do not look at that, even for junior people, exaggerating. I mean, you should spin things, you should tailor so that you're highlighting what is most important in your experience. But don't lie, don't pretend that you have a degree when you don't have it. Honesty is absolutely the way to go, right? And even if you made a mistake, if something was misinterpreted, but if you've been honest throughout, then you're fine. But once you've lied, you do in some cases get blacklisted. It's not a good thing at all. So please do not lie on your application at all.
Okay, Katya, let me just get to you. Just let's start from that point. How do you draw the line between spelling it and exaggerating? Because I see a bit of a debate in the comment section where um, sometimes you're applying for a job in the UN and maybe the position, the job, you may want to tweak your job title in your previous work a bit to align with it. For example, you were a research officer and maybe the job you're applying for, requires is something in relation to development work. And could you just tweak it and say maybe you were a research and development officer in the previous job experience so that at least it kind of aligns with it? What do you say about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And like I say, lying is definitely a no-go, but there is, as you say, a whole gray area of how far do you tailor, right? And even within the UN, people face those same dilemmas, right? Because you often have a title for a job that, the way the UN positions are structured, there are classifications for each job and sort of standard titles. It might be very simple, like human resources officer, but in fact, you might be focused on learning and development. So sometimes in the UN, we refer to what is your HR title versus what is the title that people understand what you do. So what I would suggest though is be aware that, if you do get selected for a UN job, what they are going to do, again, to make sure that no one has lied about work experience or about education, they're going to go through everything that you've listed in your application, right? So if you say you have a degree, you're going to have to actually send copies of that degree and the transcript. And if you said you've worked somewhere, the reason they ask you to add an email and a phone number is because somebody is going to go contact that organization and contact your boss and say, this person said they worked for you and they did this, right? So here's where you need to think through the example that you gave, Isaac, which is a good one. Is it an organization where that was really the title that was used for you and they don't, they're not flexible on titles? So if when the UN calls and says, supposedly Isaac worked for you as a research and development officer, if that boss goes, what? No, he didn't do anything on development. Now you're in trouble, right? And now it looks like you've lied. So that's where you want to be careful. I mean, if it's a boss, if it was a title and name only, and the boss may have even forgotten what your official title was, but knows full well that you did research and development work. And so when the UN calls and says Isaac was a research and development officer with you, and that boss goes, yeah, of course, he helped me with this and he did that, then it's no problem. So you have to use a little bit of your judgment. Again, the titles, I think, are not as important as the description of what you did. And that's where I think, again, you don't need to twist things to make yourself sound more exciting. What you want to do is really highlight, particularly under the responsibilities, when it says, did Isaac do research on development issues? Or if the work experience says, experience researching development issues, you can leave the title research officer. Just in the description, make sure it says, I researched these development issues, boom, 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 right? And that also, when your boss gets called, will get reinforced. So that's the more important way than sort of worrying about the titles.
Great. A lot of questions coming in, but I think we have just a few minutes. Katja, do you think you can give us a few more minutes beyond the 1 hour mark for us to?
Yes, sure, we can do that. Yeah.
Maybe how many minutes? So that I just manage my time around that. How many more minutes?
Should we go for another 15 minutes?
That works. That works.
Okay.
That works.
Perfect.
Okay, so let me ask this question too. Do personal networks work in terms of applying for jobs in the UN?
That is a very good question. Yes and no, right? Certainly personal networks do help. And this is where, again, to some of the questions around internships, being known already a little bit in the UN is helpful. And also for you to know people, sometimes even just to find out about jobs, right? So there's so many things going on, and whether it's a consultancy or knowing the person, again, to the question on the consultant roster, if you know somebody in the UN who can say, listen, I have somebody good on the consultant roster and recommend you, that's always great, right? Or who can even flag and say, someone's looking for a consultant, aren't you on that roster? You might want to get in touch with them. So networks are absolutely helpful. And that is why, whether it's an internship or working as a UNV or, as a fellow, all of those sort of initial, kinds of experience are certainly helpful, because you do make those contacts and because you start to understand how the system works a little bit better. But I think there's sometimes a perception then that means where people think I should be able to get a job if I have the networks, and I won't get a job if I have no networks. And I think it's not that extreme, right? It's not, just because you have networks doesn't necessarily mean you will get the job, because again, there are so many checks to make sure that the applicants are all treated fairly and equally. Like I said, even if the hiring manager knows you, if I've worked with Isaac before and I know in my mind Isaac is the best candidate, but if Isaac hasn't written on his application that he meets the requirements, there's nothing I can do to sort of shift him and put him on the top of the pile. I just can't, right? There's too many people who are going to check that and go, hang on a second, how did Isaac get on the top of the pile? And I'll go, but I know Isaac. Yeah, sorry, but we're looking at Isaac's application. He didn't say that he has this and this experience, so you can't put him in the pile, right? So networks alone don't necessarily get you in as much as they are helpful. And even if you don't have networks, it's still worth applying, particularly, I think, at some of the more junior level positions. I think there's a growing recognition across the UN that they need new talent and new perspectives from young people. And so certainly for P1, P2, and P3, there are definitely ways to get in, even if you're not known in the UN, even if you have no UN experience. So I would certainly, I wouldn't give up just because you have no networks.
Wow, thank you very much. I would want to just to as we wrap up, let's do a little bit of a discussion about ReformWorks, what you're doing now, and share with us. But before that, I know a lot of people have questions. We are going to put you can send your questions to us on LinkedIn, all of our handles, LinkedIn, YouTube, wherever, all of them, Meta, and you could also send Katya a message yourself. But we would also be talking a little bit about what Katya is doing now with ReformWorks, and I think we need to know, and I think that will be important. And I'll share the link to this video. It's going to be on YouTube. You can go watch it, and if you have questions, you send it to us or you send it to Katya directly, and it works. So, Katya, ReformWorks, what you do?
Excellent. All right. Thank you, Isaac. No, and thank you everyone for all the questions. Certainly, I am happy to try and answer more questions. So you can find me on LinkedIn. I think Isaac has a slide. I'm on LinkedIn and now Blue Sky, which is new. And where else am I? Twitter, although I'm moving off of that. Yes, and Instagram, which is also still relatively new. So so feel free. You can follow me and ReformWorks there. What we're trying to do is with ReformWorks is really, I think the questions you guys have been asking are all very good questions, and hopefully in my answer I've tried to demonstrate how this big complex organization of 193 countries is trying to solve some of these recruitment processes, right? And it's inevitably not perfect, right? But I think the more that we understand how these intergovernmental organizations work and how you manage to get governments, whether it's in the UN or the EU or the AU, all of these organizations, they only function when the countries agree and the people working inside the organization agree on the way forward and the way to do things, right? And getting that agreement is phenomenally difficult. And it takes a lot of negotiation, and it takes a lot of understanding of what works and what doesn't. And particularly on the management side, there's often an assumption that the private sector, whatever the private sector does, is more efficient and it's better, and it will make things better in the UN or in any intergovernmental organization. I'm not saying that the private sector doesn't have some things that it does well, but it doesn't work with 193 different governments, right? Sometimes the stuff from the private sector actually makes things worse because it doesn't acknowledge that, for instance, what we've been talking about today, how important this issue of fairness and trying to avoid discrimination in the recruitment process actually is. For the private sector, that's not an important priority. For the UN, it's absolutely an important priority, right? And that's why systems and processes are differently. And so, what I have found through my experience and what I'm increasingly now finding from researchers and the more I engage with ReformWorks in terms of practical tools is the better that people who work in these organizations, the better we understand how these dynamics work, how these organizations function, and what makes managing them, how we can manage them effectively, the more successful these organizations are, right? And that requires working together with people inside the organization, with member states who make the decisions, and that everybody is working on the basis of data and evidence rather than personal opinions. Because if we have 193 personal opinions just from the member states, and then another 193 personal opinions from the people who work inside the UN, you're never going to find a way forward. So that's what I'm trying to do. So certainly for everyone, when you're getting into the UN and, you're going to hit management responsibilities very quickly, and how to coordinate with member states and how to coordinate your staff. ReformWorks is really a tool to help you guys do that. So do please follow us. We are trying to give you useful tips, tricks, techniques to make management more effective for any of these intergovernmental organizations. So certainly looking forward to any of your questions, whether it's on recruitment or other management issues, and happy to help you all on that.
Okay. So could you just share maybe one thing you think ReformWorks has been able to do currently that you're really proud of since you started this?
That is a good question. I think, one has been drawing attention to some of these issues. And maybe the one I'm most proudest of, we launched our first training course in August of this year, where we really took a lot of new cutting edge research about money and how money flows to the UN and what that means largely for how effective the UN is, right? And really looking at all levels in terms of the credibility. And you do see, there's a lot of really interesting research that shows how donor countries have, in some cases intentionally, in some cases unintentionally, perhaps manipulated some of the UN processes, and how that has led to a lot of the multilateral divisions that we see here. And so the course was about getting people to understand how that happened, and then really use that to how going forward do we think about when we accept money and how we use money in the UN to make it more effective and to actually bring a more multilateral approach rather than just a donor-driven approach, which I think people really appreciated.
Wow, thank you very much. And it's been a great pleasure, and I think everybody agrees in the comment section that you've done a good job at the topic. And I think there's a question which is more of information we would like you to give us. Is there any websites for the UN where people can go in for information that could help them in terms of these applications they've been doing?
Yes, that is a good question. I think all of the different UN entities have invested quite a bit in their job sites, and generally, I think from what I've seen from the research I've done, it gets good feedback from young people. So just basically go to the different UN websites. For the Secretariat, it's an easy one. I think it's just UN Careers Portal. But again, be aware that that's just for the UN Secretariat. So UNICEF, UNDP, WFP, they all have their own websites, their own platforms of how to apply. Each one is different, unfortunately. So again, you need to follow their rules. But all of those websites, I think, are very good at providing information about how the process works, how to prepare yourself, who they're looking for. And so it's really worth reading those. Often there's also videos and maybe training courses on how to do like a competency-based interview or how to fill out your application. And those are definitely worthwhile. So yes, and thank you. Isaac has just shared the slide as well. A lot of what I talked about in terms of the tips for applying to UN jobs, you can find that information on the Opportunities for Youth website under the blog posts. So if you want to go back and refer to that, that's another source of information for you as well. And as I mentioned, you can follow us on ReformWorks on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, or Instagram as well. And happy to take questions either, on my sites, or as I think Isaac mentioned, feel free to send questions also to Opportunities for Youth, and we'll try and get those answers out there.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Katia, for joining us, and it's been very informative. And to everyone following us, if you think you'd want to share some information on job applications and how to get any tips that are important, Opportunities for Youth grants you that platform. You could reach us through email, opportunitiesforyouthgh@gmail.com. Reach out to us. If it's necessary to organize a webinar like this, we could do that, and so that you share the information. What we do is to make these things as easy as possible for youth around the world. So when we put out our survey and you said you needed information in relation to this, we decided to start this, and it's been very good, and it's been a very wonderful session with Katia. And I'm sure in the coming weeks, we'll have the next, and it will continue all through the new year. Thank you, everyone. Happy holidays, everyone. Thank you, Katia.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Isaac, for the opportunity. And thank you to everyone for all your great questions. It's been really nice to interact with all of you guys. All right. Happy holidays. Bye-bye.
Bye.